Hello and welcome to another episode of Chats with Chip. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, and my guest today is Dan Englander. He is the founder and CEO of Sales Schema. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks, Chip. Appreciate it.
It is great to have you here, and I think the topic that we're about to discuss is one that's on the minds of many agency owners because whether you've been negatively impacted by what's going on currently or positively impacted or it's still the status quo, you probably are out there looking for new business, and that really is your area of expertise. So before we dive into that, Dan, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Dan Englander again, and I'm CEO and founder at Sales Schema. My background is in the agency space, kind of first working on the account side for a boutique social media agency in New York, and I was basically like an accounts grunt. Like I would just pitch stuff all day. That most of it was rejected. And I worked on like Monster Cable and Big Ten Network and Mark Echo and companies like that, and then moved on to basically a new business role in an animation studio and other creative services, and we were selling into enterprise, and I was in a split sort of, the classic split client service sales role. And I didn't really like identify as being in sales. I thought it was dirty and I didn't like take pride in it. And eventually my boss, who I was pretty close with, was like, do you want training? Do you want to figure this out? And I was like, yeah, this is kind of a big part of my income and the future of this business. I should probably figure this out. So we got training, got really good. I mean, I got decent at it. I got on lots of calls and learned a lot. I tried everything under the sun. And eventually, not just for me, but we had a really strong offering in animation. We did well, grew from essentially 0 to 7 figures, eventually won 16 Fortune 500s and all sorts of other braggy stuff. And then, I took that Tim Ferriss red pill, when traveled Asia, self-published some books, got some consulting clients, and eventually, focused on the agency space because that's what I knew. And became what we are now, which is Sales Schema. And in a nutshell, we're a fractional new business team exclusively for boutique agencies, which is a fancy way of saying we get meetings for our clients, we keep the pipeline full, and our philosophy is that it's better done through a fractional team as opposed to having to hire and train somebody in a skill set that our clients don't always know. Insofar as getting beyond the kind of feast and famine dynamics of relying on referrals and personal networks alone. So that's kind of where we are now.
Right. And I think it's a great jumping off point for the conversation because most agency owners didn't come to it from the perspective of saying, hey, I want to be a salesperson.
Yeah.
Yet anytime you own a business, and particularly a professional services business, as the owner, it's kind of your job to be out there constantly prospecting and closing business. So, as you are thinking about how to do that effectively, obviously one solution is that you are doing it in the way that you're doing, where you're doing it fractionally, which I think makes a ton of sense because if you're an agency owner who has no aptitude or interest in sales, you still need to get it done. And as you say, hiring is a real challenge. But if I'm sort of running my own agency and I want to be thinking about doing sales for myself, because even in a fractional world, an agency owner still needs to be involved, right? I mean, you don't come in and completely supplant all of the sales activity. I assume you must be working with the owners.
Correct. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that we encounter, relatively often where we get, an owner or like a creative, and they're looking to offload sales because they hate it. They hate the rejection. They hate the work.
Right.
And I get it. It can be tough, but it's like the Peter Thiel line, like look around you. Do you see salespeople? If not, then you're the salesperson sort of situation. Like, the process of selling a complex service in the agency space is pretty much an in-house thing. Like I'm not going to say never, but it'd be very difficult to do that through an outsourced model. It's going to take somebody really getting to know your offer, getting trained on it. Our whole philosophy, though, is that the top parts of the pipeline, teeing up stuff, is probably not best done by the person who needs to be building relationships, creating proposals, and that sort of thing. It's better done through division of duties. So that's where we come in. And I think that, a lot of the times our clients are thinking of it the same way, but they're kind of like trying to hire the driver before they have the car. So they're going from, all right, I've gotten all the business for years on end from referrals, and now I'm going to hire a salesperson to go out and get business. And they hire them, they push them off into the cold, and it often doesn't work, as opposed to kind of building the machine first and getting used to just, having a system that's getting those relationships built or teed up to plug somebody into. So that's kind of how we like to think about it.
So let's talk about the way that you work with agencies. Is your focus primarily appointment setting? Do you take people further down the funnel than that? Talk a little bit about how you fit into the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure. So yes, our main focus is appointment setting and basically letting our clients know what we're seeing in the market and then building that strategically. I think the thing that's changed since we started the business is that it's moving much more towards specialization, both for our clients and in terms of how we do the process, and less automation. So there used to be a time where I think you really could just buy a list and play a numbers game and then spit out leads from it. I think those days are long over, for a lot of different reasons that I can go into. So it takes us, really having to be more of an extension of our clients' teams and understand new stuff they're doing, which is kind of like the fuel for the outreach we're doing. Understanding the market, which we're good at because, we only focus on marketing leaders in the agency space, and so on. So that's the main thing. Like, in addition to that, a lot of what we're doing is honestly an extension of what we're doing right now, is getting our clients plugged into the right audiences. So getting them on podcasts, publications, and our whole thing is like, it's just such an untapped opportunity because there's so many entities that have done all the hard work to build audiences, and very few agencies are doing the work to get on these places. You see lots of authors and consultants and gurus like me and you, right? like blabbering, but not as many of the people that are actually doing really compelling work. And I think that there's a lot of just head trash that's pervading the agency space, where they're like, well, I can't tell the story, it's proprietary. And like, you could tell a version of the story, or whatever, just I'm not used to it, I don't feel like or whatever the excuse is. But that's our whole thing, is that you might as well start by plugging into the right audience. So we also do a lot of training and support around lead generation. That's kind of what we're thinking about.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, one of the things I've noticed with agency owners, and I'm curious if you see it the same way, which is that, whenever you start talking about sales to them, they immediately start thinking cold calling, right?
Yeah.
That seems to be like the instinctive response. Oh, cold calling. Oh, I don't want to do it. But what you've said is that there really is a lot more to sales than that, right? It's about, getting out there, being in the right places,
Yeah.
Demonstrating, thought leadership and expertise and all. So there's a lot of different pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, again, people's first thought is Glengarry Glen Ross, like some sort of boiler room where you're just getting, dialing for dollars and getting rejected all day. And I think the way that outreach is moving is kind of becoming more like a digital networking sort of dynamic, right? So, okay, you might not know the person you're reaching out to, but if you're specialized, you probably know people they know. You probably are referencing work in their field. You're reaching out to CPG, you're referencing work you've done in CPG, you're referencing details that show that you've done a little bit of homework. And now, like, this thing that you're asking for, this call, I guess it's cold in that you don't know them, but it's not that cold. It's pretty warm at that point. So it's not easy to do that. It's simple, but it's not easy. It takes work, it takes a strategy, it takes optimizing it to get to the point of being able to do this at relative scale. And that's a lot of what we're doing. But I think that, I think people have fears of, like, if we do this wrong, we're going to destroy our brand forever with the people we're reaching out to. And I just haven't seen that happen yet.
Right.
And like with the campaigns we do, and I've definitely seen bad cold emails, as we all have. But I haven't seen those fears get realized with my own eyes yet. So.
Right. And I think, one of the things that I'm hearing from you too is that, you need to be thoughtful about how you're going into these conversations. It's not calling someone up and saying, hey, let's get married, become my client. It's really thinking about, that networking element. How can you find ways to work with them and sort of begin to build the relationship?
Yeah, exactly. And just to get, maybe more loftier, philosophical, and I might go on a tangent. I've been thinking a lot about what marketing is ethical, right? Where I was reading a Slate Star Codex, and Scott Alexander, which is a great blog, and he was making a point against paywalls on news articles, right? And really clickbaity headlines. And the whole like first principle was, in a capitalist system, you put out you put stuff out there and you say, here it is, you want to buy it or not. But in a clickbait situation, somebody's exposed to something that they may or that they didn't even go into that day knowing that they want it. You've created a need for something and pulled somebody into that. So I was in total agreement with this dynamic, because it's like, is that ethical? Does that work? And then I started thinking about it, and I'm like, what sort of effective marketing doesn't involve some sort of interruption? There really isn't much. There is, as opposed to organic referrals. That's the only thing really. And those are great, but obviously that's not enough to sustain almost any business aside from Apple and dynamic companies. And even those companies have to market too. And Apple is interrupting me with a billboard or an ad
Right.
or whatever it might be. So, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure what the rules are, what they should be. I tend to think that if you're making a targeted list of about 100 people and you're doing your homework on them and you're contacting them through email or phone or LinkedIn or whatever, that's a whole hell of a lot more ethical than what programmatic advertising is doing right now. Does that make it okay? I don't know. I don't know what the rules should be. I know
Right.
what the rules literally are legally, and we're obviously always in compliance with that. But I think a lot about this, in terms of how we should operate as marketers and what's okay and what's not. And, it's an evolving question, I guess.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it is, I mean, obviously, in the agency space, agency owners are already thinking about that in terms of what they're doing on behalf of their own clients. But I think it's just as important that they think about it on behalf of themselves
Right.
and how they are doing, their marketing, their sales, their outreach, their networking. And it is certainly an evolving area. So it is something I think more folks need to give thought to.
Yeah. And I don't know, again, what the right answers are, but I mean, for us, in response to all this crisis, what it sort of compelled us to do is move more towards more targeted campaigns. It sort of just accelerated trends that were already in motion for us, I would say. So, we're doing research on companies, for a lot more research than we used to do. Like, we don't want to be contacting companies that are laying off a bunch of people. Or if we are contacting them, we're doing it in a much different way, right? And so on. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it.
Well, it's I think it's particularly challenging right now because in some respects, you do have to be careful that you're not taking advantage of companies that are having problems, but at the same time, agencies have a lot of valuable solutions that can be beneficial
Yeah.
to businesses that are struggling right now. And so
Yeah.
trying to find that delicate balance of offering something that's useful to them and that they may even be looking for, while not looking like you're taking advantage of their difficulties.
Exactly. And we're, I sometimes feel like we're a little bit like radio operators in a war. Like, we get lots of chatter and we have to kind of make sense of it, because we don't get the whole picture ever. I don't know if anybody does, but that's what we're seeing a lot of. Is there's things that have surprised us. And like, we had a client in the event space, and we got the meetings with HP, Google, Microsoft, I want to say Lenovo, in a 1 to 2 week period. And this was, in-person events. And that's because it's not like these companies are saying, okay, we're just going to cut off all in-person events forever. They're like, we need to find a way to replace this with something else, be it
Right.
digital, be it some way to think about this. So they are looking for people that understand those dynamics. And, just because a company, for example, focused on in-person events, they still, it doesn't matter if it's digital, it's still humans, right? It's still the same cues, the same sort of understanding about what's compelling and what's not. So, I think even the places that are seemingly wiped out or hurt, at least on that from the outside looking in, are actually might be in the best place to help. Drew McClellan, who you might know as well,
Mm-hmm.
was talking about his clients that are focusing on restaurants are actually like, their phones are ringing off the hook. There's more places for them to help. So I don't know if, I don't want that to be like a glass half full platitude, because I do think that it's really tough, but I do think that this is a dead horse we're always beating, but the agencies that are specialized are the ones that we're seeing win right now. And I'm not sure if or when that dynamic's going to change. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's tuck into that a little bit because you mentioned specialization a few times now, and I agree with you that I think that it's important. And there are different kinds of specialization
Sure.
that agencies can do, right? So you can specialize in terms of the services you're offering. You can specialize in terms of geography. You can specialize in terms of industry verticals. What are you seeing as far as the most successful kinds, or do you really need to kind of have a mix of all three of those or more?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's easier to figure out, what doesn't work than to figure out every way it could work. And I
So what
used
doesn't
to,
work? Let's talk about that.
yeah, I think what doesn't work is the day trader approach where people are like, okay, what's hot right now?
Right.
What can I sell into right now?
And there's a ton of that right now, right? I mean, if your client base is anything like mine, there are a lot
Yeah.
of folks who are saying, what should we be pivoting to? What industries should we be focusing on that
Yeah.
are, that are resilient right now or that need help? And that's a mistake in my mind.
Exactly. Because it's like, if you're asking that question now, you're way too late,
Right.
So I think the best starting place is to look at where you can be useful as opposed to what kind of work do you want to do. We hear that a lot too, where it's like, we want to work on stuff we're passionate about. Like, we want to work on stuff that gets us up in the morning. I'm like, yeah, I get that that's great, but that's not how markets work. Markets work in terms of usefulness, right? And hopefully you can start with the usefulness and then work backwards and become passionate about helping people or, being useful to people. So I think that tends to be a mistake. So that's the main thing. And I used to frame this in terms of niching, and I think specialization is a better way to think about it, because there are exceptions. There's a social media agency that we were talking to maybe a couple of months ago, and they work all across the whole consumer sphere, but they have worked with so many humongous brands, right, and done really incredible work and have incredible case studies that they can flex a little bit more and kind of get away with it and work with a wider breadth of people. But that's not most agencies. I think most agencies, the clearest cut way is by some version of verticalizing. And that might not be saying, okay, we only work with CPG. It might be saying we work with, Drew McClellan calls this connective tissue, which I think is a great way to think about this. It's like, might be healthcare and banking and high compliance areas or something like that. There might be a through line between a few different areas. But then from there, like we talk to agencies that have that, but then they're afraid to flaunt it. You go to their site and it looks like just a Noah's Ark of work. So I think, it does take the risk and the courage to put up that shingle to say, this is what we do. And I think that's the next step that people need to take now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think that you need to be very clear about what it is that you do. And I agree with Drew about the connective tissue concept. You don't want to be doing, 3 different targets that are completely unrelated, because then it becomes very difficult to tell your story. And in fact, I just had this with an agency that I was talking to recently, and I went to their website, and I thought they had been hacked, because on there was an item on their pull down menu on their website that just seemed like it was out of left field and had nothing to do with the rest of what they were doing. And so I talked to the agency owner, and he said, no, that's just one of our areas of specialties. I'm like, well, it looks like someone hacked your site, because it's so far afield from everything else that's there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so you need to be able to tell that story in a consistent way.
Yeah. And I get that. Like, as the guy running a company, it's really easy to have a whim one morning and to just throw a grenade of chaos into your agency. Like,
Right.
I have this idea, we should make masks now. It's just...
and frankly, most of us as business owners have done that at one point or another.
Man.
And so I will fess up to that. I have done it, and my apologies to all of my former staff members.
I've probably done it this hour,
Right.
some way. So I get it. But yeah, it helps to have somebody that's like, what are you doing right now? So that makes sense.
Now, the one interesting thing that you said was, that you didn't, that the agency owners who said, I want to do something I'm passionate about, that sort of conflicted with, finding the right markets to be in. And I want to dig a little deeper on that, because I'm personally of the view that you need to kind of have both. You need to have a market that works, but you need to have something that you are passionate about, because if you hate what you're doing every day, even if you're generating revenue doing it, that's not sustainable. So I'm curious to dig a little bit deeper on that and understand more about, what you've seen with the clients you've been working with.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And I think it might be an order of operations thing, so I don't think it's mutually exclusive with passion. And I do think you're right. If you hate it, it's definitely not going to be sustainable. But then there's different decision trees or decision limbs, right? So maybe that means if you hate it, you're hiring somebody to do it that doesn't hate it, or you're selling your agency or whatever. But
Right.
Nothing happens without you fitting in like a puzzle piece into the market and being useful. And so that's kind of how I would think about it. And I think that it could be that there's ways that you can go deeper into the same market or whatever. It doesn't have to be verticalizing. It could be with technology that you're serving a wider market but doing something more specific for them. But I think that that what we're seeing to work is like, if you are specializing, maybe you could innovate more with what you're doing for those clients, right? And do more of what does interest you, or what you think would be helpful, just as long as you're hedging your bets. So it might be that 80% of your work is this specialty stuff that pays the bills, and then you have a skunkworks project that's the stuff that gets you up in the morning. And then if that happens to work and pays the bills too, then you're in an even better place, right? So that's kind of how I one mental model for approaching it.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of with my clients, I try to think of it as sort of a Venn diagram where you have a circle for passion, a circle for expertise, and a circle for marketability, and so it's where those three intersect. If you give up on any one of those three, and I've seen it, someone's really passionate about a certain industry, but they're not interested in the services, or they're passionate about an industry, but they don't have the expertise to deliver what they're trying to deliver. You need to have all three of those, and the lack of any one of them is going to cause it to fail.
Yeah, I agree mostly. I just think that maybe the passion bubble should be a little bit smaller than the others, because the passion bubble should work on its own if the others are there, or tends to work on its own if the others are there. So that's part of it. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, let's say that I'm a typical agency owner, and my business has been getting by on random referrals over the past number of years, and now I'm sitting there saying, okay, I need to put together a proper sales program. What are the first steps that I should be thinking about to build a real sales operation, as opposed to just whatever phone rings, I answer it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's all about specificity, right? So that's the first thing, is thinking about the who and moving from first person to second person. So a lot of agencies tend to be, frankly, self-absorbed, and I get that. That's kind of the way the agency services were sold for so long, was sort of this pick me sort of way. Right. But I think that has to change, and a lot of it is like, I just did a group training with a bunch of agency owners, and a lot of the stuff that we were moving towards was, getting names and faces in front of you when you're coming up with these campaigns, regardless of what you're doing, without getting into the nitty gritty. It could be whatever, outbound, inbound, writing a blog post, writing a cold email, whatever it is. But actually having the names and faces of the people you want to talk to in front of you, their industries, their titles, what they're doing, so that you can figure out, who you're reaching out to and what you're up against. And I think that to source those names and faces, it's best to start with where you're most useful, where you have the strongest case studies and that sort of thing. So from there, I could go way further into the forest of building a sales strategy, but I think that's probably the best starting place. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I think you shared a lot of good tips for folks, and hopefully things that they can start to use to work to improve their own sales operations, or start their sales operation if they're at that mode within their business. But if someone's interested in more resources, learning more about Sales Schema, where should they go?
Yeah, for sure. So we just did a webinar that I like to put up there for people. It's called basically How to Sell Agency Services in Uncertain Times, which, frankly, I know is a little bit of a clickbaity title, because I'm getting kind of sick of the uncertain times things, because frankly, times have always been uncertain.
Right.
But anyway, that's what we called it, because we can't help ourselves. And
we have to call it something, right?
Call it something.
Because I'm in the same position where, do you call it the current crisis? Do you refer directly to COVID-19? Do you refer to other things? I mean, it gets very confusing, but you need to have something. So I say to people, just get over it.
Yeah, exactly. But in short, it's kind of like how we've been approaching campaigns over the last 6 weeks, and how we're planning on moving them. So it's all about, how to set up cold email, how to do outreach, do planning. So that's at saleschema.com/crisis prospecting. One word, basically. Mm-hmm.
Simple enough. Well, Dan, this has been very helpful. I appreciate the time you've taken to share with the audience. And again, my guest today has been Dan Englander, the founder and CEO of Sales Schema.